Hi everyone, welcome back to World Civilizations 2. I am Dr. Ross, continuing our story of the interwar world in the lead up to World War II. So today I'm going to describe some of the main kind of ideological impetuses for the outbreak of World War II and kind of get us right up into the war. Then on Tuesday I'll be back to describe how the war, this middle war of the 20th century was carried out, with a particular emphasis on the crimes of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. So today I want to talk about the reasons why World War II occurred in the first place. And many historians actually would argue that World War II is but the continuation of World War I. That in fact, the catastrophe that was the first half of the 20th century was in fact a second 30 years war, fought between many of the same people, in particular Germany, Austria, against the broader, the Allied powers of France, Britain, Russia, and then the United States. But also because it really was about very similar issues, namely the question of the liberal, democratic, capitalist order that had been constructed in Western Europe and the United States over the course of the previous century and a half. Now, as Dr. Haynes and I have discussed in the past two lectures, with World War I came a crisis of liberal democracy and a crisis of capitalism. And a number of solutions emerged to deal with these crises, represented best by the war itself, World War I itself, and then the Great Depression. First, I described the Soviet solution, the communist solution of a state-controlled economy and the repression of political freedom in the Soviet Union that led, on the one hand, to incredibly rapid industrialization through the Stalinist 5-year plans, and on the other hand, incredible repression and destruction by the Stalinist paranoia and his purges and murderous rampage throughout the country. But Soviet-style communism proved to be, by some measures, an effective solution to the failures of liberal democracy. While one had to be incredibly careful that one did not fall on the wrong side of Stalin, people were, in some sense, equal in deprivation, for the most part, and as the corruption kind of went apace, less and less equal, but, you got a job, full employment. The Soviet Union, at the same time, rapidly industrialized. That the stated goal of the Soviet program was, in fact, fulfilled. And so the Soviet Union entered World War II an industrial power, unlike when they entered World War I. That's not to say they were prepared for World War II, that's a different story, but they were at least catching up economically with the West. And in fact, unlike the capitalist powers, the Soviet Union did not have a depression. They had engaged in what one could term Keynesian economics on steroids without even knowing it, and they did not have a depression. Another solution, described by Dr. Haynes in the last lecture, was democratic socialism, or New Deal policies in the United States. The attempt to save capitalism through limited state intervention in the economy, to kind of even out the worst excesses of industrial capitalism. Guaranteeing that one's savings in a bank will not simply evaporate through the creation of the FDIC, for instance, or the emergence of the Works Projects Administration to provide employment by the government when the private sector failed. And in Western democracies, such as Scandinavia, Britain, France, the United States, one witnesses, at least to some extent, the beginnings of the end of the Depression. As Dr. Haynes explained, it really was World War II that ended it. But these limited interventions set the stage for later interventions, especially in Western Europe, but also in the United States, under what Dr. Haynes called, and we call, in fact, the welfare state. There was a third solution, however, to the problems of liberal democracy, one that we'd like to think has receded from history, one that we often argue was a false solution, but in fact seemed quite appealing to the people who encountered it in the interwar period, that of fascism. And we see here pictured a propaganda poster in Japan of the kind of three quote-unquote fascist powers that I'm going to address today, and I'll explain a little bit why I'm saying quote-unquote, about calling all of these powers fascist. United by virtue of a kind of conviction that they needed to find a different way out of the struggles of liberal democracy. We have Italy, Japan, and Nazi Germany. Fascism in all three countries, if we want to call it that, and I'm going to stop nuancing this statement, I'm just going to say fascism in all three countries at this point. Fascism was a response to the perceived weaknesses of both liberalism and socialism. And it flourished in the places that perceived themselves as victims of Western powers. And in fact, fascism will most find a home in the places with the greatest amount of grievance against the West. Now, as I already said, that would be Japan, Germany, and Italy. Fascism, whether it's variants of Nazism or in Japanese militarism, were not aberrations. And the people who fell under them were not dupes. They were not brainwashed. Rather, they were responding to the very real conditions in which they found themselves. And in fascism, found a solution. Fascists promised that they could solve the failures of liberal progress. That in fact, it is in fascism that these countries could flourish. However, rather than turn to the egalitarian promises of socialism or democratic socialism, fascists reached for nationalism, an extreme form of nationalism that emphasized equality only within a particular nation state and inequality between that group and everyone else. So no matter where we're looking within a fascist state, we are going to witness extreme forms of nationalist pride combined with the conviction that one's nation is superior to all others. Fascism, therefore, rejects both the premises of liberalism and its emphasis on progress and equality, and liberty, and the premises of socialism in its emphasis on equality and universal values. Fascism, and I'm going to continue to define it as I move forward a little bit. Fascism first emerges in Italy, and it's the subject of one of your documents for today that I understand is quite long and not very easy to understand. So for the next 3 slides, I'm going to try and break down that document by way of defining what fascism was, or is, one could say. Fascism was coined first by the Fascist Party of Italy, by Benito Mussolini, who will become the Italian dictator in 1924. And he was kind of reticent to define what fascism was, as long as he was working towards power. But he did at one point, in this text, Born of a Need for Action, set down at least some of the underpinnings of what it is. And in what I think is the most important quote within the document, and I'm going to turn to 2 more in a couple seconds, but in what is the most important quote, the title quote, Mussolini lays down what he believes fascism is. So let me get out of the way of the screen and read this quote to you. Fascism was not the nursling of a doctrine worked out beforehand with detailed elaboration. It was born of the need for action, and it was itself from the beginning, excuse the typo, from the beginning, practical rather than theoretical. It was not merely another political parry, but even in the first 2 years, that's the early 1920s he's referring to, in opposition to all political parties as such, and is itself a living movement. Mussolini, in other words, rejected the political machinations, the political conflicts of liberal democracy in which he lived, in favor of a doctrine that emphasized the need to behave and act outside those limitations. Unlike both liberalism and socialism, with their theorists and their ideas and the notion that they can understand the world outside of the way in which people behaved, fascists simply acted. And that's why, to some extent, one cannot really understand what fascism is unless one studies what fascists do. So the first part of my definition of fascism is that fascism is a behavior. Fascism is a way of acting towards both one's fellow citizens within a nation and towards those outside the nation. Fascism rejects both socialism and liberalism. If fascism is, in many respects, what people do, rather than what they say, what fascists do rather than what fascists say, then fascists define what they should do by virtue of what socialists and liberals did. In other words, if a socialist and a liberal believe something, the fascists believe the opposite. And in this regard, this is one of the reasons why fascism is so unique. Both liberalism and socialism, as Dr. Haynes especially described, come out of an Enlightenment tradition. Fascism rejects that tradition. It seeks to overthrow it. If the Enlightenment argued that we are all fundamentally equal by virtue of our ability to reason, fascists say, actually no, we are all fundamentally unequal. So in this quote, drawn from your primary source, Mussolini explicitly rejects the notion of Marxist socialism. Fascism repudiates any universal embrace, and that could be about both socialism or liberalism. And in order to live worthily in the community of civilized peoples, watches its contemporaries with vigilant eyes, take good note, he wasn't a concise writer, takes good note of their state of mind, and in the changing trend of their interests, does not allow itself to be deceived by temporary and fallacious appearances. Such a conception of life makes fascism the complete opposite of that doctrine, the base of the so-called scientific and Marxist socialism, the materialist conception of history. Fascism now and always believes in holiness and in heroism, that is to say, in actions influenced by no economic motive, direct or indirect. So think back to Dr. Haynes' lecture on socialism in the way in which he emphasized that a good Marxist, a good materialist, argues that one's behavior is motivated by one's economic position. A fascist rejects that idea. It instead emphasizes that there is in fact a spiritual motivation for human action that cannot be reduced to the economy. And that any attempt to use the economy to kind of come and conceptualize universal truths, as Marx tried to do, is but a kind of ideological illusion put in the face of an ideological illusion that a fascist will tear down. One reason this is important, there are many reasons why this is important beyond simply understanding what fascism is, but one reason this is important is that the first victims of fascism are socialists. And that's true of both Italy and Germany. The first victims of fascism are socialists. Socialists, in other words, are the enemy of fascists. If we give a term on your final exam, fascism, or even Nazism or Adolf Hitler, and you say that they are socialist, that is incorrect. Because fascists hate socialists. Socialism is the opposite of fascism. Fascism is an ideology of the right. Socialism is an ideology of the left. This used to come up a bit more when we used to talk a little bit more about totalitarianism during the Cold War. Keep these two things separate. Okay. Fascism also rejects liberalism, and that's my third and final quote from this text and my definition of fascism. Now today, the liberal faith must shut the doors of its deserted temples, deserted because the peoples of the world realize that its worship, agnostic in the fields of economics and indifferent in the field of politics and morals, will lead, as it all has already led, to certain ruin. Ignore the middle. The liberal faith must shut the doors of its deserted temples because it has already led to certain ruin. Fascists reject liberalism. They reject the notion of human freedom. They reject the notion of human equality. They reject the notion of human reason, even. And replace it with something much more elemental, one could say. So fascism is defined by what it is not, as much as what it is. And that's why fascism is so hard to kind of just put down a coherent notion, coherent definition. However, one historian, one of my favorite historians, a French historian, has tried in a book called The Anatomy of Fascism, came out a number of years ago now, 2004, laid out what he thought fascism was. And this is, if you want to sum up and you want to kind of simplify it than what Mussolini is saying in that extraordinarily long text, it is this. Fascism is a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation or victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants, working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites, abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints, goals of internal cleansing and external expansion. So a bit of this was already in President Mussolini and what I've already described. Look at the first clause. Fascism is a form of political behavior. Paxson does not say it's an idea. It's not an ideology. It's a way of behaving, marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, and victimhood. Fascists argue that our nation has been treated unfairly, that we are being taken advantage of, and that we need to do something about that. And usually, the way to fix the problem of that weakness is, by attacking, where do I want to go? Here we go. Attacks what is seen as the roots of an internal impurity, socialists, Jews, immigrants, gay people, and external expansion. The key for a fascist is not to build a universal notion of progress. It's not to build a universal community of equals, as in liberalism or socialism. Rather, it's to purify the nation of those who threaten it from the inside and to expand outward. And indeed, these are the ideas that unify all three of the countries we're going to talk about today, with an emphasis on the most famous, Nazi Germany. Just going to pause a little bit so I can get a drink of water and you can read that slide. Okay. Actually, we're 24 minutes in. So I have something for you if you're watching this. We've been asked a number of times about extra credit. Here's an extra credit opportunity. If you're here in the lecture, you can send me an email saying with the words Robert Paxton in the body, and I will add some points to your most recent EWC. Email Dr. Ross, no one else, Dr. Ross. You can do that by the time, let's say by Sunday at midnight. Okay, so how were fascist ideals actually put into practice? I'm going to address Italy, Japan, and then conclude with Germany, which is where the rest of my lecture is going to go. So, how did these themes come about in Italy and Japan? So think about our definition, and this is where, I'm not going to tell the whole story, but here's where I want to focus. What kind of weakness, what kind of grievance did Italy have? Italy fought on the side of the Allies in World War I, had attended the the Versailles Conference, and signed the peace treaty. However, they did not get what they wanted. In Italy, this was termed the mutilated victory. That the Italians, despite their bravery, despite their willingness to fight for the Allies, did not get especially all the territory that they thought they deserved. Within Italy, the people who were most blamed for this failure were the liberal parties, who had control of the Italian government after the war. And indeed, it's within the very people who should have been supporting the liberal parties, the middle class, who felt the most sense of grievance and the most willingness to turn to to people promising to overcome the humiliation that Italy had suffered, after the war. Enter the political party formed by Benito Mussolini, his fascist party, who promised to restore Italian greatness and, importantly, to protect the middle class, to protect elites as well, from the dangers of socialism. So Mussolini does essentially two things. He promises to the middle classes that he will solve the problems of liberalism and he will protect them from socialism. And he did so quite violently. His gangs of fascist thugs roamed the countryside of Italy and bashed in the heads of people who disagreed with them, mostly socialists. And indeed, it's that very violence in the countryside that justified Mussolini's claim to the prime minister, the premiership, to be prime minister, and then to his dictatorship. In other words, fascists like Mussolini create the very problems they claim to solve. In this case, violence. Once Mussolini took power, and again, I'm not going into the details, I'll describe the rise of Hitler in much more detail. Mussolini immediately, or almost immediately, excuse me, not really immediately, but eventually, about 10 years after he takes power in the 1920s, engages in the external expansion part of the fascist program. Italy, seeing itself as humiliated at the Versailles table, decides to take matters into its own hands and invades Ethiopia in order to establish a new Italian empire. In fact, Italy had tried this once before in the late 19th century, but they had failed. Ethiopia remained the only independent African nation until the invasion in the 1930s. Here's Ethiopia added to Italy's already existing possession of Libya. So, you think back to the definition, fascism is a form of behavior marked by willingness to use violence against internal enemies and external, and aimed at external expansion. Italy, we see both. That the Italian fascists, in order to overcome their humiliation after World War I, take power, purge Italian politics, and begin to construct an empire. We see much the same thing in Japan. Here's where the word fascist isn't quite correct. At least I think a lot of historians would argue it's not quite correct. But many of the same kind of components are present that it's close enough for our purposes. Japan exited World War I also after fighting on the side of the Allies, and emerged, in fact, a much stronger power than it had entered it. And indeed, immediately after World War I, it seemed like Japan was heading towards the formation of a liberal democracy. It had a parliament, it had a prime minister, all that kind of stuff. A couple things intercede in that path, however. First, Japan was continually humiliated on the world stage due to racism amongst the Western powers. Once again, go back to the Versailles Treaty. Within the Charter of the League of Nations, Japan desired the peace process to include a statement of racial equality, especially in the League of Nations. Western powers, not least the United States, knowing that in saying that it would threaten the system of racial segregation that characterized US society, rejected that idea. And Japan is sent back home. So despite having fought for the Allies, they are clearly second class. Second thing that happens to Japan to kind of create that sense of grievance, to create that sense of crisis that feeds a fascist movement, was the Great Depression. The Depression hit Japan quite hard. Of all Asian powers, it is the most integrated into the world market. And in response, a group of army officers essentially begins the process of taking control of the Japanese government, making very similar claims as the Italian fascists. We can solve this problem, but we can't do so through democratic means. In 1931, this kind of rogue group of army officers arranges for an explosion on a Japanese-owned train route in China, especially in the region of Manchuria, which should be familiar from the past lecture, as a pretext for taking over the region from China, and they renamed Manchukuo. So in order to kind of justify or prove that Japan is just as good as everyone else, that Japan cannot be taken advantage of, a military soft coup takes place, and processes of external expansion begin almost immediately. While this is happening, the military begins to cooperate with roving bands of quote-unquote patriots, just as in Italy and as we'll see in Japan. And the military tamps down on political dissent and essentially creates a paramilitary state with the existing emperor at the head. So just like in Italy, Japan, faced with humiliation following the Versailles Peace Treaty, turns both externally and internally in order to purify itself and become the great nation it believes it should be. Indeed, it's Japan that will kick off World War II, and here's where I'm going to get a little outside chronological order. In 1937, Japan invades China, the Chinese mainland, creating the first front in what will become World War II by 1939-1941. They did so in order to ensure that they would have necessary living space, and that's a term that will come up again in a second, and resources in order to create the great Japanese empire that they believed was necessary in order to succeed on the world stage. In the course of doing so, the Japanese also committed one of the first atrocities of World War II, which your textbook describes to some briefly, the rape of Nanking. The rape of Nanking took place in the capital of China, which you might be able to tell by the name, was a systemic program of mass murder and mass rape that occurred in the winter of 1937 against the Chinese people, and by that I mean civilians. During the period, about 6 weeks, beginning in December 1937, the Japanese army murdered about 40,000 to 300,000, and this tells you how difficult it is to count accurately in this context, civilians, and began, well, this is the first time this happened, first time in World War II, used rape against Chinese women as a tool of terror. One important difference between World War I and World War II is that World War II was engaged against civilians. World War I remained battles by armies. World War II was not. World War II was a battle of armies against civilians, essentially. And the Japanese begin that process. Okay, so that's Italy and Japan. Most of the time when I teach this in person, I can tell that it's actually the Germans that we're most interested in. And in fact, it's the Germans that remain the most characteristic and the most horrible example of the fascist states. And it's there I'm going to focus the rest of my lecture. Excuse me. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details as I would in my Nazi Germany class, but I will at least tell you a bit more about the process that I did in the previous two cases. As Dr. Haynes described, Germany in the interwar period faced a number of problems in many respects, but not entirely due to the Versailles Treaty. And if we're looking for Germany's sense of grievance, where that comes from, if that links all the fascist powers, it is the Versailles Treaty. That the German people never accepted the legitimacy of a treaty that forced them to pay massive amounts of reparations, that took away their military, et cetera, et cetera. That the German people fundamentally felt that they had been treated unfairly after World War I. And indeed, they were treated unfairly. If you'll note in Dr. Haynes' lecture on the origins of World War I, he never claimed that Germany was at fault for the war. And I don't think any historian, well, most historians would say it's more complicated than that. And yet the Versailles Treaty made Germany take responsibility for the war. And so Versailles, the Versailles Treaty remained this kind of sense of injustice amongst the German people and enabled a man like Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party, National Socialist Party, to take advantage and to eventually take power. Not through a coup, but through a democratic election. Indeed, it's difficult to understand at first the appeal of a man like Adolf Hitler. When World War I broke out, he was essentially a loafer. He was an artist in Vienna. He's Austrian, not German. He is painting what most would call bad watercolors. He recognized within himself that things weren't going so great. And so he actually joins the German military in World War I and serves with distinction. He's wounded, he's awarded several medals, that sort of thing. And like so many German soldiers after the war, he was extremely dissatisfied with how the war ended, with defeat, but also with the lack of anything to do once the war was over. And so Hitler just joins an already formed political party called the German Workers' Party. At the time that Hitler joined, it had about 50 members, mostly fellow ex-soldiers, who got together to listen to one another, essentially give anti-communist and anti-Semitic speeches. Now I'll come back to anti-Semitism in a moment. Hitler made a name for himself in the small German Workers' Party and eventually renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party in 1920, and he became its leader. Now they name it National Socialism as a propaganda ploy. It is not socialist. It was very nationalist. Again, I can nuance that and describe all the ways it kind of was socialist, but for the purposes of this class, remember, National Socialism is not socialist. It is nationalist. 2 years later, the Nazi Party had about 6,000 members and had a newspaper. They formed paramilitary groups, the SA, the Sturmabteilung, the stormtroopers, and a personal bodyguard, the SS, who would become the guards of the concentration camps. The Nazis at first wanted to follow the lead of Mussolini, and in fact, Benito Mussolini was Adolf Hitler's guide for the initial kind of round of Nazi violence. In 1923, Adolf Hitler attempts to take over Germany by force in what is known as the the beer hall putsch. Putsch means coup or revolt. This fails miserably. He doesn't have enough support, he doesn't have the backing of the military, and remember what I said about the importance of the military if you're going to carry out a revolution. And he's arrested. He's put on trial, and he's sentenced to 5 years in prison. Here's a moment you kind of want to think about what's going on in Germany. Hitler committed treason, literally treason against the German state. If you commit treason, you usually get a little bit more than 5 years, right? It's the only actual crime in the US Constitution. It's a big deal. He gets 5 years. It's then reduced to 8 months in prison for good behavior. This tells you that the German political system, the German judicial system, was sympathetic to Hitler. So remember, one of the kind of main arguments of this lecture is that fascism was not something that comes in and takes over. It's something that people find appealing. It's something that people vote for. And they will vote for Hitler in great numbers. But it's also something that relies, as Paxton's argument pointed out, relies on sympathies within the existing state in order to take power. In any case, while in prison, Hitler writes a book, a very famous book. I hope you have already heard of it, named Mein Kampf. Means my struggle in English. And in Mein Kampf, Hitler laid out his program, his primary ideals. Just to summarize, and I don't assign Mein Kampf, but it is in your reading if you're interested. But here's how I boil it down. Two less important things and then two important things. In Mein Kampf, he wanted the overthrow of the Versailles Treaty, and he wanted the end of the existing political system in Germany, the Weimar Republic. He also argued, these are the more important things for our purposes, that Germany required Lebensraum, living space. So think about Paxton's definition, external expansion. For Germany, that external expansion had a very particular direction and a very particular goal. Germany needed space to grow, and it would do so in the east. It would do so in the east. Lebensraum, living space in the east. Second of the important, Hitler called in Mein Kampf for measures to diminish the influence and power of Jews. Hitler laid out his racial understanding of the German people, both the Jewish and the German people, and declared the Jews enemies of the German race. And in doing so, he contributes and draws upon a very modern understanding of racial difference, rooted in the science of eugenics, as something rooted in the blood. Not something just that you can see on the skin, not something that comes about for cultural or religious reasons, but something you pass down. And let's be clear, no legitimate scientist believes this anymore. Race is not genetic. Race is something we impose upon physical characteristics. But for Hitler, and this is a chart showing the passing of Jewish traits through the blood. Now, I often get asked, why the Jews? Mostly it's because the Jewish people in Europe had long been the targets of powerful people looking to justify their own failures. The Jews, in other words, had for 1,000 years been scapegoats. They had been scapegoats in Eastern Europe, they've been scapegoats in Western Europe. And what Hitler did was draw on that pre-existing animus, characteristic of Christian Europe, and modernized it and weaponized it, and asserted that by purifying German society of Jews, he would create the kind of ideal, what he called a Volksgemeinschaft, a people's community, that was necessary for Germany to overcome the humiliations of Versailles. So I'm going to talk about the Holocaust next time, but for now, think about, once again, Paxton's definition. External expansion, Lebensraum; internal enemies, the Jewish people. Worth pointing out now, however, there weren't too many Jews in Germany. Most of the Jews, not coincidentally, lived here, where Hitler was going to expand. So, last bit of my lecture, last 10 minutes, maybe a little less, hopefully less. I'm going to describe the road to war. Hitler's ideas, as expressed in Mein Kampf, were not the only reason for his popularity, though they were part of it. The bigger reason for his popularity is that the Nazi Party promised the German people that they would solve the problems they faced. And that is especially the case in the wake of the Great Depression. And we can see that in this chart, the rapid rise of the Nazi Party in Germany on the lead up to 1933. The Nazi Party, this is right after the Beer Hall Putsch, does not do well through the course of the 1920s. And indeed, it's right around this mid-1920s period that Germany seems to be stabilizing. They have re-entered the international community, they've joined the League of Nations, that sort of thing. The Great Depression happens here, right here. And what happens? Their numbers skyrocket. Their numbers skyrocket. So this is the percent of the vote. Give them 2 more years, and it just keeps going up. Note, they never get a majority. They don't need a majority. That's not how the system worked. In 1933, 1933, having reached, in 1932, having reached 33% of the vote, the Nazi Party is able to form a coalition, and Adolf Hitler is named Chancellor of Germany. He quickly, as in Italy and as in Japan, moves to consolidate power. And again, we're not going into the details today. And by March into April 1933, Hitler has essentially established absolute power within Germany. And he proceeds to move towards his ultimate aims: external expansion and internal purification. The European powers are not quite sure what to do with Adolf Hitler. They don't know how much to believe when he says he wants Lebensraum in the East, and when he says he wants to eliminate the Jews. They don't know how much to believe him about overturning Versailles. And through the course of the 1930s, the other European powers follow a fairly hands-off approach to Germany. By 1935, 1936, this approach is essentially called appeasement. Let's give Hitler a little bit of what he wants and hope that that will be enough to stop his constant demands. And remember, what are his demands? Lebensraum in the East. This was a mistaken calculation. The other European powers failed to understand what fascism really was. Fascism doesn't see other nations as equals that you can negotiate with. It sees other nations as either oppressors or oppressed, and you want to be the oppressor. So the willingness of other European powers to give Hitler what he asks for only encourages his increasing demands. By 1938, things begin to reach a head. In 1938, Germany annexes the country of Austria in direct violation of the Versailles Treaty. And the European powers do nothing. Later, he makes a different kind of demand. I would like a little bit of Czechoslovakia. This is still 1938. The reason he says he wants a little bit of Czechoslovakia is that there are a lot of Germans here, and those Germans should be a part of Germany. A conference is held in Munich. Representatives of Britain and France and other countries, Mussolini in particular, go, and they agree to give Hitler a bit of Czechoslovakia. In response, the Prime Minister of Britain goes back home and declares that I have achieved peace in our time, that he has solved this problem, that Hitler will be satisfied. But just getting a little bit of Czechoslovakia doesn't get you the Lebensraum. It doesn't get you the living space. Hitler begins to prepare for war. He begins to prepare for war. Now, one thing he does in order to prepare for this war is that he tries to ensure that the problem that occurred in World War I would not occur in World War II, namely a two-front war. He shocks the world, in early 1939, summer 1939, by signing a peace agreement with Stalin. Why does this shock the world? Because I've been telling you the whole class, the whole lecture, that communism and fascism are enemies. And indeed they are. Both Stalin and Hitler signed this pact in order out of self-preservation. For our purposes, Hitler wants to ensure that the Soviet Union will not join the Allies when he starts his war for living space. The Soviet Union agrees, knowing that they are not prepared to take on Germany in a fight, and indeed having their own plans for Eastern Europe. When this agreement becomes public, the policy of appeasement, the policy, again, of giving a little bit to Germany in the hopes that they'll stop, is abandoned. And instead, the Allied powers of Britain and France reaffirm their commitment to the security of Poland. And they say, if you overstep our agreements again by doing anything to Poland, we will go to war. I think you know what happens next. Hitler, trying to get his living space, invades Poland in September 1939. At that moment, two things happen. The Soviet Union, abiding by their agreement with the Nazis, attempt to put as much space between their homeland and the Nazis by invading Poland as well. And, where I'm going to leave us, France and Great Britain declare war on Germany. And it's there we'll pick up our story on Tuesday.